first question is, what is your stance on illegal immigration?
Two parts. First is the people who are classified as dreamers should be given amnesty, and Congress should have passed the appropriate legislation to recognize them, first of all, as legal in the United States and as eligible for citizenship. For other illegal immigrants currently in the United States, the U.S. should adopt an updated version of the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, which was the last general amnesty for illegal immigrants currently in the United States who can prove they've been in the United States for at least 5 consecutive years. And third thing is, we should do certain things about border security, but not build a wall. We should essentially fund a greater number of Border Patrol officers for the southern border, also increased electronic surveillance, and where appropriate, build additional fencing, which would probably amount to maybe 200 miles or so of additional fencing along the border, beyond what currently exists.
So, do you think that media has portrayed immigrants in a certain way, whether it be like good or bad, or they're leading towards one side?
The press has always portrayed immigrants in a certain way. This was true of immigrants arriving in the first half of the 19th century. And immigrants were always portrayed based on the particular set of beliefs of newspaper editors of the time period. Today, we throw in reporters. So, does the press portray immigrants objectively? I would say more so in the last 25 years than historically. Because historically, the press, unless it was immigrant press, because remember, we used to have 1,000 foreign language newspapers in this country in the early 20th century. And all of the 1,000 foreign language newspapers represented a variety of immigrant groups in the U.S. And obviously they were friendly to immigrants. So if you're talking about the foreign language press, that's always been friendly to immigrants in varying degrees. The English language press, that is the American press, has varied. And essentially, in the 19th century, certainly in the first half, there was considerable hostility towards immigrants and the press. And in the second half to the early 20th century, if it was dependent on where and whether the immigrant groups were likely to vote Democratic or Republican. What I mean is, if it was in the Midwest, and we're talking about immigrants from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Germany, then the press is going to be friendly towards immigrants. If we're talking about Italian Catholics, the answer is no. And the Northeast, again, it depended on what part of the Northeast as to whether or not they would be friendly or hostile towards immigrants. Since in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were very few newspapers that were not either Democratic or Republican in editorial viewpoint, and that's skewed how they viewed immigrants. Democratic newspapers in New York would generally be pro-immigrant. Republican newspapers, again, depending on whether the particular immigrant group, in the view of political leaders in the Republican Party, could be potentially Republican voters or not, as to whether they'd be pro-immigrant or not. Generally in New York City, the Republicans would be anti-immigrant Republican newspapers. And of course, the radical newspaper, the socialist press, generally was pro-immigrant because the immigrants made up a number of their locals. The socialists got very strong support from Germans, from Jews, Italians, Finns, and some unionized British immigrants. So they could depend on support from those immigrant groups. So they tended to be pro-immigrant. So again, it depended on political view, where in the country.
Okay, so do you think that the immigration regulations today are too strict?
You talking about legal immigration?
Yeah.
Well, since my son-in-law is an immigrant, and since my stepdaughter and my niece are both from China and are adopted, my parents were both from Poland. So I would say that current immigration laws are going to be, well, let's put it this way, difference between the law and Donald Trump's interpretation of the law. Let me start with the issue of refugees. American refugee policy in the abstract is quite fair. As, however, interpreted by the Trump administration, it is discriminatory against refugees, including people who want to claim refugee status, which was made very clear when Senator Sessions was the Attorney General of the United States. See, although President Trump fired him, Attorney General Sessions shared exactly the same perspective on immigration as the president did, and was carrying out the president's policy. And so, essentially, I would say, again, objectively, American refugee law is quite fair, as interpreted and as being essentially administered by the Trump administration. It is anti-refugee. As for the general immigration policy, again, the general immigration policy essentially pursued the objectives of the United States immigration policy since 1965. First choice, first benefit is the family reunification. That is the first criteria. It has been the first criteria since 1965. Despite efforts to revise American immigration law both in 1990 and in 1996. In fact, what happened in 1990 was an expansion of legal immigration by a third. Although some people from both the left, the Barbara Jordan Commission, and from the right have felt that that was an unnecessary expansion of legal immigration. Because in the 1990s, we actually averaged maybe as much as 1 million immigrants a year. That went down a bit after 9/11. The 1990s were the second heaviest decade of legal immigration since the decade of 1905 to 1914, which remains the heaviest decade of legal immigration in the last 150 years. And so I would say that legal immigration laws, as they are currently exist, are reasonable. In fact, to some degree, they're generous towards immigrants.
Okay, so
However, as administered by President Trump, they're less so. Because he's given orders through Homeland Security to turn the screws, both on legal immigrants as well as on refugees.
so you don't think they need to be changed at all, or?
Oh, as far as they're
revised?
being changed, that gets you into a debate over two issues. One, the numbers. And President Trump and his advisors would like to reduce the numbers to virtually zero, if they could. And I think that the current proposals I would not go along with. They're being proposed by the Trump administration to cut legal immigration. I would have gone along with the proposals that came out of the Jordan Commission, which was named after Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, a Democrat from Texas. So I would have gone along with her recommendations in the early 1990s to return to the legal immigration limit of the 1965 law. But that isn't what the Trump administration wants. It wants to cut immigration far lower than that. And that I don't agree with. And its rationale is just plain stupid. One of the rationales coming out of the Trump administration is if you reduce legal immigration or cut it out altogether, that will discourage illegal immigration. That makes absolutely no sense. So regardless of their aims, they're just plain stupid in trying to implement their policy. And it's because what they're trying to do won't achieve the objectives they want to do, other than essentially eliminating legal immigration to the United States, which is a major mistake, both historically and as public policy. So when you got the idiots running the asylum, what are you going to do? Fortunately, Democrats control the House, so no immigration law proposed by the Trump administration will get anywhere.
Okay. So the last question is, do you think immigrants are treated with more suspicion now than in the 1900s?
Say that again.
Do you think immigrants are treated with more suspicion now than in the 1900s?
No. That's been consistent since it's actually been consistent since the 1790s. Under the Federalist administration of John Adams, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. One of the part of that act was to extend naturalization from 5 years to 14 years out of hostility to immigrants coming from Ireland and France. So the idea that hostility towards immigrants today is worse than it was in American history, that's not true. It's been worse in the past towards immigrants. The extreme hostility in the 1840s and 50s towards Irish Catholics entering the country. And then in the early 20th century, the extreme hostility towards Jews and Italians. And so in the 1880s, the Chinese immigrants, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It has been a consistent element in American public opinion, but it's varied as to what percentage of the American public opinion in any given decade share the hostility towards immigrants. But we have had a host of political movements dating to the American Republican Party, the Native American Democratic Association, the Know Nothings, which came fairly reasonably close to electing a former president as president. So we have had larger anti-immigrant political movements in American history. And we have had presidents who've been strongly anti-immigrant. For example, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge. But we've had presidents who have been sympathetic to immigrants when they were presidents. Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson for the most part. So it's varied with who's in office.
Okay. Well, that is it. Thank you so much.
Right.